Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation from the press. Last year, I came as a participant. This year, as a speaker. Next year, a helper. I get one of those orange T-shirts. Okay, thanks for the brief description of me. Perhaps the most noticeable thing at the moment about me is 2 weeks ago, I was having dinner with a colleague who I hadn't seen for a long time. He was a former student at Churchill College. And we were actually celebrating the fact, if celebrating is the right word for it, that I've been in this industry 40 years. As a teacher, trainer, academic, and so on. Now, the reason I told you that was not for the round of applause, although it was very nice. It'll become apparent in a short while. I work for an organization called Study Group. Have you heard of Study Group? It's a rather large organization based in the UK, North America, and Australia primarily. It's an Anglophone-based company. And I work for Embassy English, which is the language division of Study Group. And the reason I mentioned that is that's the context I'll be talking from. And I'm conscious that your context will not be necessarily the same as mine. When I was asked if I'd like to talk about it, I said yes, because it's one of the things that I've been working on for the last year, trying to understand in my own organization what our CPD is like and how it can be improved. So, when was the last time you learnt something about teaching and learning which inspired you to change what you do in the classroom, and having made that change, your students' outcomes improved? It was a question asked a couple of months ago in May in Harrogate in the north of England. Beautiful place. And I think, in a way, that question is the entire session. Something that inspired you, that changed your practice and impacted your students. Okay, the title of the talk is Developing Teachers for Stronger Results. It's about the impact teachers have on student outcomes. That's the main text. But there's always a subtext. And now I want to go back to my friend, the former Churchill College student who I had dinner with 2 weeks ago. And he asked me a question. And he said, come on, Vic, you're giving a talk on CPD. In your 40 years, how much has it changed? The more things change, the more they stay the same? I kind of been a lot more optimistic than that as a teacher, as a trainer, and I tend to favor this. I don't know if you can recognize it before I put in the missing word, but for me, it's more about seeking and doing something else that I learn. Have a guess, what's the missing word? Okay, I'll tell you. And I just love it. Because for 40 years, I've been seeking and blundering. And it's really quite nice to blunder in ever more refined ways, but still blundering. Okay. I was going to lead with this, and then I saw Andy Buck's session, and then I thought, okay, I won't. And then I left a slide in, and then I thought, I will. So, here's a question for you. Put the following 5 leadership dimensions in order of relative impact on student outcomes. Which for you is the most important, the most significant, the most impactful? Which is number 1? Promoting and participating in teacher learning and development is twice as impactful on student outcomes, twice as impactful as the others. The others are important. I'm not saying they're not. But this is twice. Okay? And I have a lovely phrase that I remind myself when I'm being a dreadful manager. I say, lead by learning. And this is what it's about. Okay? So that was to be my subtext. And then I thought, this might be. And you might have seen that quote earlier in Andy Buck's session. Every teacher needs to improve, not because they are not good enough, but because they can be even better. Dylan William of Willem and Black and Inside the Black Box, that kind of thing. I have a but. Oh, before I have a but, notice at the bottom there, this quote from the Standard for Professional Development by the Department for Education in the UK. That heads it up. And they have 5 characteristics. But for me, it's not about the leader. It's not about the teacher. It's about the student. I'll ignore that one for a minute. Well, just to say something in my context, one of the things I've noticed in 40 years is English language teaching is very well contained, but increasingly of late, it's become much more interested in what's happening in mainstream education. And I just brought those 2 things up. One, the Cpd expert group, and 2, the other, that conference I refer to, not just because of the conference, but one of the participants there, a guy called David Weston, heads up something called the Teacher Development Trust. Just Google it. If you don't already know it exists, it's got wonderful resources on it. Okay, developing teachers for stronger results. The assumption I'm working on is that improving teacher performance improves student outcomes, improves student performance in 3 ways. The performance management, continuing professional development, and culture. Given the timing, I'll probably focus mostly on CPD, but also on performance management. I kind of want to give you a few takeaways before I start. The first one, I hope, is I'll give you a bit of food for thought about continuing professional development in your own context, and possibly about performance management in your own context. I hope I'll give you a few ideas and suggestions that you can incorporate in your own context. I hope I'll give you an idea about what is and isn't effective continuing professional development. And I hope I'll give you a few ideas about how we can change and rethink performance management. Okay, what I want to focus on in CPD is primarily one session, the in-service training session, sometimes called in-service teacher training session. And I want to focus on that, conscious that there's a lot more involved in CPD. When you think of CPD, do you think of something that looks like that, where you have in-service training sessions, you have a VLE or an LMS, depending on how you describe it. You have lesson observation, courses, and conferences. In case you're looking at them, not sure what they are, under VLE, the My Development and Workplace are study group VLEs that we use. The My Development we developed ourselves, but Workplace, I don't know if you recognize it, Workplace is Facebook for companies. Okay, so focusing on those areas, and you might want to include performance management in there. But I want to focus mostly on the first one as a way forward. And as that slide says, if you ask most teachers within my organization and many organizations, they will tell you that continuing professional development is doing quite well. It's pretty good. But the evidence suggests that our current practice is somewhat lacking. And, if you like, being more optimistic, research suggests that if we take certain steps, if we do certain things within our CPD programs, student outcomes can be measurably and significantly improved. So the first one there is on continuing professional development, the amount that's spent on, and the second one on performance management. It's not working, it's broken. Now I think they're actually a bit harsh to say that. Why is CPD the key to improving student attainment and reducing inequality? And he has 4 questions, and on his website, very detailed information on them. Why concentrate on teaching? Why focus on professional development? Why not focus on performance pay for teachers? And why the quality of teaching and not the quality of teachers? And I'll let him do the work. First of all, perhaps you've heard of a guy called John Hattie, who, at the turn of the century, interesting, a lot of this is the turn of the century, okay, pointed out, based on meta-analyses, that in terms of improving student achievement, the two most important things are the student and the teacher. Together, they make up 80% of what measurably impacts student learning. What the student brings to the table is 50%, and what the teacher brings is 30%. So just putting those two together, you obviously maximize. And obviously, as you can see there, if we focus on the teaching, then it will measurably impact. But not just any teaching. We have to be a bit careful. So a different study from the Sutton Trust. The difference between a very effective teacher and a poorly performing teacher is large. During 1 year with a very effective maths teacher, pupils gain 40% more in their learning than they would with a poorly performing teacher. So it's not just teachers, it's the quality of the teaching. So why focus on professional development and teacher learning? Robinson, time spent on effective professional development not only improves student outcomes and teaching morale, but also disproportionately benefits weaker students. For me, understanding weaker students and how you can help them has been something I've been focused on for quite some time. It also empowers the teachers to do more to raise their own levels of skill. And we come back to, and this can significantly be enhanced by leaders. Why not focus on performance pay and remove the worst teachers? In my own organization, possibly because we have a number of schools in the States, they significantly argued for performance-related pay. So I can attest from a personal point of view that impact on morale is huge, and it doesn't do what you're trying to set it out to do. In short, 3 things. Effective professional development can improve learning outcomes for all students, improve teacher morale and retention, and create a sustainably self-improving system driven by confident, empowered teachers. Impressive. So let's have a look. That is a CPD program for one of our schools for 2016. My question is it a good one? A bad one? Do you like it? Not like it? Not have enough information? So firstly, what effective CP isn't. And to some extent, we've got to be careful these are not Aunt Sally's, but I'll go through them first. Effective CP is not one-off visiting experts being flown in, vis and to wit. And for years, when I was doing teacher training and going around the world doing teacher training courses, I drew people's attention to this chart from Johnson Showers. You'll see it was done late 90s and turn of the century. And the point of it was, it doesn't matter how good this is in terms of the delivery, whether I simply talk, whether I give you a demonstration, or whatever, it impacts very little until it becomes part of the practice in the school with coaching and mentoring. So arguably, everything I'm saying both thus far and to the end is a waste of time because it doesn't impact. I like to think it's not entirely a waste of time. And obviously, your visiting experts are conscious of the fact that it is a one-off. What can you do in the one-off that is going to help, that is going to impact? So obviously, a good workshop leader would make sure it was interactive, would make sure it was hands-on, would make sure it was practical, that it fulfilled the Monday morning rule, i.e., what can I do with this on Monday in my class? And I could do that with this. Here we'll have a list of CPD activities. We recently had a summit in one of our schools in the States, and we were brainstorming a whole range of CPD activities. Now, what I could do in terms of what makes effective CPD is go through this with you so that you'd have lots of ideas to go back to your schools with. So talking about lesson observation, both supervised lesson observation by an academic manager and lesson observation by peers. Recently, we did a school review in our San Diego school. And one of the questions was, how often do you observe teachers? And she said, well, once a year. And how much do you think that impacts on their development? Well, not a lot. And I didn't say anything else, I just left it at that. It was just an information thing. And a couple of weeks after I left, she said, I've started doing lesson observation with all the teachers once a week. Wednesday afternoon is lesson observation day, and I do a different teacher each week. And I thought about it and sent her a reply saying, okay, so lesson observation for every teacher, in order. So a teacher gets observed once every 14 weeks. How long, those of you who are in Andy Buck's session, how long should a teacher go back, an observer go back to a teacher's classroom? 14 weeks or 2 weeks? And I wrote back to the academic manager, Courtney, and said, how about if you don't observe all the teachers, you ask which teachers want to be involved, and you observe 2 or 3 teachers. And you observe them together, one after the other, and you get them observing each other. So you form a little team and work on it together. She thought that was a great idea, and that's what they started doing. The kind of intensiveness of it is beneficial to teachers. And all I did was take the idea from back in the day when I was a Delta trainer. When we did the Delta course, you watch the teachers every day. And after a short time, they got used to it. But if you're only observing once or twice a year, there's a big build-up, and it's anxiety-making. So I could go through that. I could talk about something I'm really passionate about, collaborative lesson planning. Peter Dudley's thing about lesson study, where you get 2 or 3 teachers together, and they plan lessons together. Then they observe each other's lesson. One of the nice things about what he does there is he points out the big thing that people say about CPD programs. They're too expensive. The cost, we can't afford it. And in one of his articles, he pointed out it would cost you the price of 6 hours total of teacher time. How much would that be? Okay, you get my point. You could go through them all. The problem that we face as one-off session givers is that you end up with, here's a good one. Here's a good activity, go and do this. And you end up with an armory of activities for teachers with no rationale behind it. So, move on. Another one that's frequently highlighted as something that's not effective for professional development, the one-size-fits-all. And I'm very conscious right now of one-size-fits-all. Am I talking to a group of people who are up to speed with everything I'm saying, that you're familiar with everything I'm saying already? Am I talking to people, some of whom have got lost because it's a completely new area to them and they haven't had any involvement in CPD? There's probably 1 or 2 in there who are quite bored because they're not getting anything to do, but that's part of it. Okay, but with a one-size-fits-all, what are the stages in teacher development? Do we actually have classes where we put a beginner and an advanced student together? No. So why do we, for professional development, put the novice and the expert together? And again, it's easy to set up the Aunt Sally and say, so one-size-fits-all doesn't work. Well, it kind of does, because I'm doing it now. Okay, a third area. I think this one is the more problematic. It's to do with compliance versus learning. So teachers' professional development is actually being directed and led and decided by managers, by regulatory bodies, by managers. And however laudable it is, what's their commitment to it? Something I'm going to show you as an example in a minute or two is progress tracking. Something that we're doing within Embassy is we've developed this system for progress tracking for students. And it's a great idea, and it works well. But The teachers didn't decide we were going to do it, so what's their level of commitment to it? And I think one of the biggest issues around this is to do with participation in decision making. Just before I go on, because I'll go on now to look at what is effective CPD. And just before I do that, I want to make a distinction between collaborative and participative. Collaborative is where you're working on something together, collaborative lesson planning, collaborative observation, and so on. And the participative is to do with the decision making, to do with whether it's managerial or democratic. Okay, characteristics of effective CPD from various forms of research, a number of studies. First of all, we can take the practical, the hands-on, the immediately useful as given. We can take the needs-based, the classroom-based, the collaborative, the reflective as given, as important, what I mean. Perhaps less so the involving teachers in the choice of areas to develop. But two things I do want to highlight. One is the key to success in CPD is when CPD mirrors the learning of students. What is good for one is good practice for the other. And I'll come back to that in a bit. But the final one, and I go back to my initial quote at the beginning, impact on students. The final one here, evaluated. Most CPD is not evaluated. Or if it is, it's evaluated at the same level that this session is evaluated. The participant reaction to it. But what do they learn from doing it? How is that assessed? And what's its impact on students? Okay, I know you can't see that, but there's a copy in the PowerPoint afterwards for you. Okay, what some practitioners have done, and I'm going to show you 3 examples, is come up with acronyms to help analyze CPD programs. The first one is David Weston's, and it's FREEZE. Focused, responsive, engaging, expertise, and sustained. Those are the 5 key features, 5 key characteristics of effective CPD. Focused. Zoom in on specific subjects and topics. One of the things about our CPD programs in our schools is they are very varied, but they don't focus in on 1 or 2 things. It's a bit of this, a bit of this, a bit of this, and a bit of this. And what David Weston is saying is effective CPD needs to be focused. 1 or 2 topics that are followed through. It also needs to be responsive, engaging. I'll come back to engaging. You need to have expertise, and it needs to be sustained. So focusing over a number of weeks. I think something in the literature is for CPD to be effective, it needs to be sustained over at least 2 terms. Another acronym for you, Sparky. This one's from the Cambridge Teacher Development Team, sitting in this room, I think. So I better get it right. Sustained, personalized, applied, reflective, collaborative, and impact. I want to say impactful there. The sustained, I like this. It's systematic, not fragmented one-offs. Personalized, we've covered. Applied. I love that statement. Increased mindfulness is the first step to change. Collaborative as opposed to participative, and impactful. So clear objectives, monitoring and tracking progress, impacting on teaching, impacting on learning. Okay. And one from Embassy English, which, for those of you who know her, appalls my wife, because it's taken from Star Trek. Engage. Actually, I think it should be engaged. So evidence-informed, needs-based, goal-oriented, additive, ground-up, evaluated, and have a guess what the D stands for. Disseminated. I kind of need an endpoint for it. What they're going to do with it. Okay. Now, what is quite nice, you take something like this will be made available to you afterwards. You take something like this and use any one of them to evaluate a CPD program. So we could take it, we could go back to that program and evaluate it in terms of what its strengths are, what its weaknesses are, and what information we don't have. Okay? All right, very briefly, an example of how not to do it. By the way, the person you're looking at is a guy called Chris. And he actually works in one of our schools. He works 1 mile down the road in Embassy, Cambridge. Okay, very briefly, one of the things that we've been doing within Embassy, one of our big concerns with students is that we have 90% of our students are on general English programs. And they're on continuous enrollment programs. So they start any Monday and they leave any Friday. They can study for 2 weeks or 50 weeks. So not surprisingly, the class composition changes quite remarkably weekly. And it's the same, those of you who work in Anglophone destinations will know it's the same in all Anglophone destinations. Students have that problem. Now, if you have a class composition that changes weekly, how do you monitor progress? How can you track progress? And within our industry, it's something that people tend to avoid answering because it is difficult. But the answer is technology. You individualize progress tracking, you individualize progress testing, and using technology, and you can track it that way. So what we do is when students arrive, or even before they arrive, we placement test them, so we know their entry. At the same time, we've worked out, using the technology, what their level will be when they leave. So we can tell them on entry, this is your entry level, this is your proposed exit level. And we can track it regularly throughout. Okay? So you get something like this, where the student can actually see their progress. Now, the point of the exercise is not simply for them to see their progress. The point of the exercise is to involve them in it. And one of the things that we use to involve them in it is what we call the PLP, the Personalized Learning Plan. And here you can see a personalized learning plan for a student. And what we do with it is we structure tutorials around it. So we start with a student having information about their progress, their rate of progress. Are they on track to reach their target or not? Okay? And then various stages to go through. The student goes through my course. So evaluating whether the course is meeting their needs, whether they're in the right class, whether they're making progress. Then they can evaluate their English, their strengths and weaknesses, listening, speaking, etc., etc. And they do that jointly with the teacher. Then my previous study plan, because what they do based on those, with the next study plan, is they develop a study plan, a series of activities that they can do outside the class to help improve their English. Things like spending time talking to their host family in the evenings. Now, as you can see there, we have certain issues with it. It is a good idea, it is a system that works, but teachers struggle to give students smart advice on learning strategies. I.e., the student identifies they have a weakness, for example, in listening. My listening is weak. I'm an elementary student. Teacher, oh good, watch TV. That was actually a genuine comment. So I'm elementary and you think it's going to improve my listening by watching TV. And the point there is they're struggling to identify smart advice. Tutorials are not seen as significant. And coaching and counselling skills widely vary. I observed a couple of tutorials for below target students. They were underperforming students, given by two completely different teachers. And in the first one, the teacher was teaching the advanced class. And the student was underperforming, and he said to the student, "What level is your English?" And the student said, "Advanced." "No, you're in the advanced class. What level is your English?" And he said, "On track says you're upper intermediate, B2." And the student said, "I know." And they then continued the conversation about why he was underperforming and what he could do about it. Contrast that with another teacher who was talking to an underperforming student, and the teacher began the tutorial by saying to the student, the tests say you're not on track, that you're underperforming, but don't worry about that, test's wrong. It's to do with the quality of it. So what do? We set up a workshop to work on writing smart action plans for students. And it was sensibly set up. Recording a few students, get the teachers in a workshop to analyze it, see what the strengths were, see what the weaknesses were. Job done. Similarly with tutorials. An interactive workshop, what makes a good tutorial? But it didn't work. And maybe what we could have done, with a bit of seeking and a bit of blundering. See, the issue that we're faced with here, and I come back to the participation bit, the issue we're faced with is teachers don't know what the problem is, and we're providing a solution to a problem they're not yet familiar with. And a one-off session with no follow-up, no implementation, no refinement, changing practice, etc. What we could do is we could get them to weigh in. Here's the problem. You might recall back in Andy Book's session, he was talking about asking people rather than telling them. Get them to weigh in and then buy in. Buy-in doesn't come from enthusiasm. It comes from being involved in it. So right from the outset, get them to weigh into it. And then agree the why, the what, and the how. And let them work it through. Don't provide them with all the answers. Give them the means to get the answers themselves. And, not surprisingly, include it in the teacher's PLP. We could evaluate that. I've run out of time. So, I kind of have to leave it, don't I? Come the end of it, one of my questions is, so, we've had a one-off session, hurriedly done. I'm sure you cheated on the clock. Hurriedly done. What do you get out of it? It's ineffective, according to the research, to do a one-off and then finish it. So one of my questions is, what could we do next? Or we could have a real workshop where we evaluate the CPD program, the planning, the implementation, and the impact. We could ask a few questions, or I could encourage you to ask yourself a few questions. What are you taking away from this session that could impact in your context? If you think it can impact in your context, how? And when will you do it? For me, one of the most striking things about innovation is simply getting people to agree when they're going to do it. And having done it, how will you monitor the progress? How will you assess the impact? Okay. Thank you for listening.